The second reading for us today continues actually in the story with the 39th chapter of the book of Genesis, picking up with the second half of the 6th verse. That's why it says 6a, 6b on it. And this is something interesting, little Bible trivia. The numbers for the chapters and verses weren't included until the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages. When these things were first written, when Paul was writing his letters, he didn't put little numbers in there for us to keep track of things. And so this was somebody coming up with how things should be divided later on, and sometimes it makes sense and other times it doesn't. But continuing with the story of Joseph and Potiphar and God already at work. Now Joseph was a handsome and good-looking man. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. May God's blessing rest upon the experiences of Scripture on this day, upon the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. I think I've mentioned before I use the narrative lectionary as a discipline. It pushes me to get into texts that I may normally not choose to get into. And it keeps me from just preaching on the same favorite texts over and over and over again, which would make me happy, but would not really do a lot as far as building the faith. And so sometimes a text comes along, and on one day it is not very troubling to the soul, and on another it is. This text was in the narrative lectionary. It is set aside for us for worship and for growth on this day. And when I first looked at it and started spending time in prayer over it, I said, well, it's the classic story of Joseph and Potiphar in prison, and I think we can go places with this. And then I started spending time with others who were wrestling with this text. People who were raising questions in this day and age that maybe would not have been raised a year ago, 2 years ago even. How would we have felt if the roles were reversed? if it was Josephina and Potiphar instead of Joseph and Potiphar's wife? How would we react in this? Even listening to folks who aren't normally versed in Scripture, who have read it and they said, golly, I've never known a man to act that way. It raises questions. How do I, as a minister, bring this text, breathe this text? How do I open myself up to what God is doing in this? And what seems to be going on? And how does it fit into the idea of a lifeline? Well, the thing to keep in mind, the lifeline for us to hang on to is to understand that God is already at work. We're picking up the story partway through. God has been active in this family since Abram. God has promised to use this family to bless the world since Abram. So God is already at work in the midst of everything that is going on. In the midst of the visions that Joseph had that led his brothers to react poorly and throw him into a pit, to take his garment from him and to give it to his father, saying, your son is dead. God was already at work. God was at work when the brothers went back to the pit and pulled Joseph out and then sold him off to go to Egypt. God was already at work, and God was at work when Joseph was purchased by Potiphar to go into the household as a servant, a slave, an enslaved person. And so here we have these three things that are juxtaposed for us. We have issues of power. We have issues of prestige and issues of place. The power that we wrestle with in this story is the power of people, human, secular power, and the power of God. The issues of prestige have to do with the way we understand power, in the way that we react to what we see and hear, and how God reacts, what God is doing. And then the issues of place themselves, where we expect power to be wielded. Joseph ends up in the house of the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And he becomes the second most powerful person in the whole house because God is already at work. Joseph, who had been already cast into a pit once and stripped of his garments, is elevated and put into a place of great prestige. Everyone would know that even though Joseph is an enslaved Hebrew, that he was a very important man. Everyone understood, because what Joseph did was undergirded by the power and the authority of God, and so he was called a blessing. And it got to the point where Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything. He just sat back and, what am I going to eat today? Which is a hard decision to make. I remember standing at the pita party stand yesterday at the air show going, golly, falafel? Hero? Tabbouleh? Baba ganoush? I don't know. It's a hard thing to do. If only I had a Joseph to take care of things for me. But perhaps that's missing sort of the point of God being already at work. Potiphar, having reaped the benefits of the blessing of God through Joseph, just kind of laid back and let things happen. Joseph will take care of it. Joseph will take care of it. Joseph, who was wearing the trappings of great prestige in the palace, not of Pharaoh yet, but in a very important place. But then the story is shifted again. This Joseph, who has already gone from being number 2 in his personal family, the most beloved of his father, down into a pit, to number 2 in the number 2's house, ends up being caught out again, loses his garment, and once again finds himself in a pit, a prison. And God is already at work. The human trappings of power and prestige and place have once again been stripped away from Joseph. He finds himself in one of the few ancient prisons that existed. There just weren't a lot of prisons in the ancient world. We know this by looking at ancient laws. There's very few laws that say, for this you will go into prison. Look at the 10 Commandments. Look at the Code of Hammurabi. Egypt was one of the few kingdoms in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world that actually had a prison system. And it was organized. And so Joseph, who had been at heights and depths already, found himself in a deep place where we might wonder, because he is now far away from the trappings of power and prestige in place, how it is that he can have any connection to God at all. And yet we hear in the text that once again he is elevated. He's still in prison. But we know that Egyptian prisons needed scribes, and we know that Joseph was an educated man. So this is a lesson to everybody: get your education. Because the warden of the prison, noticing that Joseph has something special about him, raises him up to number 2 in the prison, just below the warden. And the warden, like Potiphar, can just sit back and worry about what it is he's going to eat. Hard choices to make. And God is already at work. For the stage is set for the next part of the story. If we were to continue reading along, we would find that Joseph in this prison is in a place to work with 2 others who are cast into the prison, one of whom will be released and one of whom will be condemned to death. And from there, Joseph will be elevated again, and he will become number 2 in all of Egypt. He will be next to Pharaoh in his story. So we have this constant up and down in the realm of people, power, prestige, and place. And this thread running through, bless you, this thread running through of God being present and undergirding all that Joseph has done, in connection to that promise made to Abram generations before. Through you the world will be blessed. For it is Joseph's work that will carry Egypt and the surrounding Mediterranean countries, nations, peoples through a great famine, including the people Israel. It is through Joseph in that line that God, who is already at work, functions. And so that's where I'm at with this. But it still leaves me that lingering, disturbing relationship between Joseph and Potiphar's wife, the unnamed woman in Scripture, one of many. And what would we do with a text like that today? How would we understand this text theme of power and prestige and place today, and then that troubling relationship in the way that Potiphar's wife is often portrayed? Well, I think today we might ask ourselves, what are the things of power and prestige and place that we look to that we have built? Yes, they may be undergirded by the authority of God already at work, but if those things were to disappear and be cast into the pit, are we grounded enough to continue the work we are called to? Are we centered enough to be able to hold on to the relationship that we have? Are we rooted deep enough that if the rug was pulled out, we would be able to continue to serve to the glory of God? I don't know. Personally, I don't want to find out. It worries me. I don't like the idea of being garmentless, or being cast out from my family, or being cast into a pit or a prison. Even though I believe strongly that God is already at work, I'm not certain I am in a place where I want to find out how much of my faith is connected to the power, prestige, and place of the things that humans have built, and how much of it is truly undergirded by the work of God. But we do have faith. We do believe that God is already at work and that we have been called to be a part of it in some way, shape, or form. Joseph had this sense of vocation about him. He had this idea of what he needed to be doing, and he responded in faith to it. He drew a line and said no, and no was a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence. God is already at work. I think that's where we are today. Thanks be to God, and amen.